Guys, how's it going? JK47 here. This is my first YouTube tutorial. I've never done a YouTube video before, and that being said, I would appreciate if the comments could maybe veer away from stuff other than the content, because honestly, I know my microphone sucks, and I know that the encoding is bad, but I really wanted to share this content with everybody. I thought it was a good place for me to start as a YouTube instructor, because I've gotten a lot of questions over the years about my drum programming. I'm an electronic music producer, and recently I kind of cracked the code, I feel, on a riddle I've been working for a very long time. I feel that I figured out the secret to Meshuggah's songwriting. Meshuggah is originally a thrash metal band out of Sweden, and for something like 30 years they've been making really innovative, groundbreaking metal music. And one of the things that's most notable about them is their rhythmic complexity and their musical intelligence without losing a sense of groove. And I've been trying to figure that out for a long time. I think I finally got it. I wasn't even sure what to call this video. I mean, I went through a series of names, and some of these are facetious, but I really was pretty happy to get to where I'm at, so I wanted to share that. And I feel like I can do that in 3 pretty simple steps. So in terms of my gear, I'm running an old version of Reason through Rewire into Cubase. I like Reason because it has a nice visual piano scroll, and it's really easy to see the sequenced notes. And I'm using a Line 6 pod with a Squire baritone Jaguar for some junk guitar tones, just for some context. So step 1, the secret to writing music like Meshuggah. Understand that you probably have to start with a computer. You have got to start with some sort of drum sequencer, some sort of drum programmer. So we know from interviews and we know from written articles that Meshuggah's drummer, Thomas Hake, is the primary songwriter, and he's using a computer to write and assist in writing, and sometimes he's using a drum programming software to actually put the final product to tape. So it's a good tool to have as a guitarist or any kind of composer to be able to map out your drums and play with ideas. And so for me, the first step to writing like Meshuggah is write in odd time signatures. For some of their music, this is just a piece of the puzzle, and for some of their music, it's the only piece. And when I say write in odd time signatures, write in an odd number numerator over an even number denominator. I have an example riff here. It's 7/4, and it's a repeating 7/4 pattern. And the way that I first started writing in odd time signatures is go ahead and take a drum kit sample and have whatever number you want your numerator to be. If it's 7/4, 7 hits with your cymbal hand on the downbeat. So it's a hi-hat. We've got 7 hi-hat hits on the downbeat. Put a kick on the 1, so you know when your riff is starting over and over. And then put snare hits wherever they sound appropriate. So this starts off like a 2 and 4. And this is what it sounds like. And I have kind of a goofy riff here for some context. So once you get used to writing in time signatures that are not in 4/4, not an even number over an even number, but more often an odd number over an even number, that's the first step. If you can start to write riffs and drum beats that sound kind of catchy and interesting in odd time signatures, that's the first step. There are a lot of bands that do that, and they just write, one song here or there that are all in a bizarre time signature. I think about like Alice in Chains, they wrote Them Bones. Bands like King Crimson would write entire songs in odd time signatures. So it's not like there isn't a context for that. It just takes a little practice to get used to. So that's step one, write in time signatures other than 4/4. For most people, I'm sure that's old news. And the next step is to start writing riffs that have an alternating time signature, so bouncing back and forth between two time signatures. Here I've got something mapped out where I've got a riff in 4/4 and then a riff in 7/4 right next to each other, bouncing back and forth. So I accented the first note of the first riff with a kick and a crash. And so that makes it obvious where the riff starts. And because there are two different time signatures right next to each other, there isn't a clean resolution. It's not obvious, and it kind of keeps the listener on their toes. And this is step two, being able to bounce back and forth between different time signatures. So let's have the same riff with some musical context. So as you can see, just kind of having two time signatures next to each other, it's not totally unheard of in modern rock music. It's not a new idea, but it adds a level of musical complexity. And like I said, it keeps the listener on their toes. It's important to note that, again, the cymbal hits are all on the downbeat. And so even though the kick and snare pattern, the riffs themselves end kind of prematurely and doesn't resolve the way you imagine it will, there's still a continuity between the two riffs and they flow together. But because they're switching back and forth, it keeps the listener on their toes and it makes the music less predictable. And you start to see maybe where Meshuggah is getting to the idea that, you know, they have such intricate music that is almost impossible to count, but it doesn't lose its sense of groove. So this is a trick that they use outright as well. But this is just step two. So now let's move on to step three. Step three is where you really make your money. Step three is where most of Meshuggah's musical trickery is happening. And this was the part that was hardest for me to figure out. It was explained actually in an interview by Thomas Pridgen, who's the former drummer for the Mars Volta, and he explained it very clearly in a Drumeo interview. And he would say, start with a simple riff. So here's a pretty straight ahead riff. Kick, kick, snare, kick, kick, snare. We've got all of these quarter notes played on the hi-hat. There's no changes here. There's nothing unpredictable about it. And while there's a time and place for that in music, especially in heavy music, you see it a lot in like classic Metallica. This might actually be For Whom the Bell Tolls. The idea is that although it is a repeating pattern, it's very straight ahead, it's predictable, you know what's going to happen next. But what Thomas Pridgen would say is to get that Meshuggah feel, take a simple drum riff, kick, kick, snare, and then you start to play with the placement. So if you look at my drum scroll here, we break that riff down so that it's just kick, kick, snare. And you have your cymbal hits repeating on the downbeat of the quarter notes. Then you duplicate that and play the same riff, but I want you to move your hi-hats onto the and. So instead of falling on the downbeat, which would be here, you slide them over. So they're on the and, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. They're hitting on the ands. So this creates the dance beat, the disco beat. The cymbal hits on the upbeat. The kick and snare pattern doesn't change. This is a very different feel. It's not even really a rock feel. It's very dancing. And then the next thing you do And here's where you make your money. You have these two riffs with two different cymbal hand patterns. The first with the cymbal hits on the downbeat. The second, same riff, cymbal hits on the upbeat or the and. Slide them together so that the cymbal hits fall at the same interval. And the kick and snare pattern moves with them. Now take a listen. Because this cymbal hits fall at the same interval, it provides continuity. This is why you can continue to bob your head or mosh, tap your toe during a Meshuggah song. But because the kick snare pattern moved, and the kick snare pattern now starts in an upbeat, and it alternates between starting on a downbeat and an upbeat, it adds a level of musical complexity within a single measure of music. So if we were to add some context, you start to see what Meshuggah is doing. This reference is lifted from a Primus song, so right on if you caught that. But the important thing is that the cymbal hand remained the same, but the kick snare pattern underneath it moved so that it's alternating between starting on a downbeat and an upbeat. And in a single phrase of music, you have a switch. That is the Meshuggah style. That is the Meshuggah flavor. That is the trick that they use more riffs than not, more songs than not, more records than not, than any other thing that they do. It is so characteristic, it's difficult to find any of their content in their discography where they're not doing this. And you might be saying, all right, well, this doesn't really sound like a Meshuggah song. I don't really see how this is a good example. But let's get a little more contemporary and let's actually look at something from the discography. So if we put these three concepts together, odd time signatures, switching between time signatures, and having a meta measure with a switch in between, where the kick snare pattern moves between upbeats and downbeats when it repeats, but the cymbal hand remains the same. Then you have a beat like this. And in context. So again, I put a symbol on the one just to kind of give some reference, but without that point of reference, you see that we have a cymbal hand that remains consistent. In this case, instead of quarter notes, it's halves, but you could use quarters as well. So you could break this down. So you've got quarter notes, continuous. And the kick snare pattern is repeating, falling first on the downbeat, and then on the latter half of the riff, in between those downbeats. So for a complete rotation of that, it's going to be actually in 5.5 over 4. And to get a whole number, we have to double it. They do that frequently too. So 11 over 4. But as I mentioned before, they often have time signature changes even within a few phrases of music. So in this particular example, they went ahead and pulled that riff over, and instead of having it be 5.5 over 4, they have two measures of 5.5 over 4 or 11 over 4. And then they just pull it over and cut it off at 5 over 4. So 11 over 4 stops here, 5 over 4. And take a listen to it. So that's that abrupt finish that we talked about, which makes it almost impossible to count out their music. It's what makes it so dizzying and complex. But because the cymbal hand remains the same, there is a groove, and it's something you can kind of tap your toe along to. So that's it. Odd time signatures, switching time signatures, and having a meta measure within a single phrase of music by pulling the kick snare pattern from just a downbeat to a downbeat, switching to an upbeat. And you might be saying, hey, that's one example. That can't possibly be true for everything. Well, I would say that variations of that are pretty common in their music. So to go back to the Primus example, one thing that they used to do, Meshuggah used to do, is that instead of moving the kicks and the snares when you change your interval from downbeats to upbeats, which would sound like this, you would just move the kicks, leave the snare and the hi-hat the same. Whoops. And you'll find that in Meshuggah's early writing, when they were kind of more thrash-oriented, that was more of their feel. The album Chaos Sphere would be the example there. So what you can see there is that the repeating pattern, changing from downbeats to upbeats, would only pertain to the kick. You can see here we've got a repeat, we've got another repeat, another repeat, and kind of has a triplet feel on the kicks, but again, hi-hats and snares are not changing. And so if you would apply this to your own writing, which, I mean, as my friend Jeff would say, hey, 15 years ago, Djent was cool. 15 years ago, this idea was really pretty smart. But how might you apply it to your writing today in a way that's still relevant? It's kind of hard to say that this band hasn't been influential and important. And as I said, I learned this trick from Thomas Pridgen, who, when playing for the Mars Volta, was using this example in his own work on that album they won a Grammy for. So I see it as being relevant. And one way to kind of think about it as being relevant in your own work is to just kind of play with it when you're doing your own programming. The way to do that, as I said, start with a simple beat. Pick a kick, snare pattern, repeat it. And then pull it back so that it alternates, again, between falling on the downbeat and the upbeat for the cymbal hand. You see how it flip-flops back and forth there. And just like Meshuggah would do, I have a couple of instances of it. You can see I have two here, two repeats there. And then, just to keep it interesting, throw in a measure of something that is the same riff shortened into an even time signature. So that last one will be 4/4. First two are in 7, last one in 4/4. All right, guys, that's it. Please leave any comments or questions you have in the comments section. I'm going to link some material that makes it a little bit more concise. And of course, I'd like to thank That Sound Drums for their drum sample. This is their Material Girl drum kit from their 1985 Reason Refill. I'd like to thank Casino Guitars for supplying me with my baritone Squire Jag. And thanks again for your time, guys.